Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. It's 12:30, and we are getting started with carbon markets and natural assets in practice, hosted and presented by Julie Davenson. Since folks might be watching this through the Whova interface, please, I just want to remind you, if you have any questions for Julie along the way, whether you're on your phone or you're on your computer, over to the right on your computer is the Q&A or the chat for this session. If you have any questions at all as Julie goes along, please drop them in the Q&A. I can use that to ask her questions at the end. And if you like any of the other questions that you see there, please feel free to upvote those as we go along as well. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Julie and say thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, yes, thanks for having me, and hello, everybody. My name is Julie Davenson, and let me see, I'm just going to go, hold on one second, to the next screen here. Oops, hold on one second, technical difficulties. Why is that not? Hold on, I'm just having trouble going to the next screen here.
We might need to unshare and reshare if your computer's slid out. Yeah.
All right.
Technical moment. Here we
go. Of course, it worked earlier. Now
it's all good. I have a suspicion it might have gone to sleep in your PowerPoint.
All right. Yep.
There we go. Perfect.
Yep. Okay. Great. So just a little about me. My name is Julie Davenson. I am an accredited Savory educator and professional, and trained in ecological outcome verification. A bit of my background: I managed an educational farm and organic dairy where I helped manage the grazing program and also led a savory hub. And most recently, I was working with the Regenerative Food Network, which was based out of Vermont. And the Regenerative Food Network was investing in infrastructure, particularly several businesses in Vermont, including Higley Hill Meat Processing, Vermont Natural Tannery, and Southshire Meats. And that was the goal of that was to provide infrastructure that would help farmers access markets and also serve as an anchor for what they were trying to create, what was called an ecological asset trust that would later be transferred or moved into a natural asset company. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And this is just a picture here of me at Haystack Farm in Vermont conducting ecological outcome verification. It's a measurement system that the Savory Institute has created. And I'm just going to go to the next slide here. Oh gosh, please tell me. Okay, great. So as far as carbon markets go, what's all the fuss? What's all the excitement? So the voluntary carbon market is estimated to be worth upwards of 50 billion by the year 2030. And what has facilitated all the excitement about it are a couple of things. One is the Paris Agreement. Companies are seeking alignment with these goals. Also, there are technical gaps. Companies are limited by technologies that are available at scale and not cost prohibitive in removing carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions. There are time gaps. Companies do not have all the means to eliminate emissions today in their supply chain. And of course, there's stakeholder pressure. People want companies to improve and reduce their emissions. Some of the critique, and I would put myself in this category just to be fully transparent, but a lot of these markets are rooted in colonial constructs. Otherizing of nature is a colonial construct created so that it can be objectified and profited from. It sets nature up as a victim that needs to be saved. And most recently, this summer, we saw the White House reveal natural accounting standards. And so they were seeking comment on that, and that's just setting precedents for what will later come are the natural asset companies. This also threatens indigenous lands and smaller holder farmers around the world, but especially in the global south. And the New York Stock Exchange is using this to promote further commodification of nature for profit. And critics worry it could be the next bubble following the housing bubble. And all of this is rooted back with English philosopher John Locke, who believed among these fundamental natural rights, Locke believed are life, liberty, and property. The extrinsic value exchange, which we'll hear a video and directly from Doug Eager, the founder of that shortly, has estimated that nature's economy, the asset value is over 4,000 trillion. And the new task force on nature market study, they've done a lot of research on this. They are arguing that the emerging sector could be equivalent in size to the world's largest economy. So there's a lot of money to be made here. Natural asset companies are not yet established, but they are working on that to do that through the New York Stock Exchange. And the project that I was involved in was looking at that and working on developing measurements that natural asset company has not gotten off the ground. So I'm not sure it will happen. But the Intrinsic Exchange Group is pioneering a new asset class based on nature. And the primary purpose of these companies is to maximize ecological performance, the production of ecosystem services to which they have rights and authority to manage. That's an important point, and we'll come back to that later. But as we listen to Doug, I would just encourage you to listen to the language that's being used, and a lot of these terms are financialization terms of nature, and perhaps compare that to other sectors. So I'm just going to play this video. It is about 7 minutes, but I thought it was important for you to hear directly from the founder in his own words.
The place to start, IEG was founded in order to bring forward a new asset class based on nature. The foundation of it is a new form of company, the natural asset company, which you have said obtains the rights to the ecological services that nature produces, and by extension is not only valuing that, but the underlying asset itself that produces these services. The central concept here is to deal with the problems that we left nature out of the mainstream of our economy in the beginning. And that really has two parts. There's negative externalities, so the costs that are not borne, that we all recognize by the adverse effects in pollution, lack of destruction of biodiversity, a lack of economic opportunity, a variety of problems. And we're also very focused on the positive side. So if we could capture those positive externalities that are, valued somewhere probably in 125 trillion a year. So nature's production of goods and services, and we could figure out a way to bring that into the mainstream and convert that natural asset and its productivity into financial capital and level the playing field, so that we have the ability to look at the relative values of land use and ultimately the price signaling to the productions of goods and services. So the natural asset company would obtain the rights. It could be on natural areas. That could be to further conservation, to fund the management of conservation areas. It can be the rehabilitation or restoration of degraded landscapes. Another very key area for us working is in working lands. It's almost 50% of the land surface of the planet is devoted to agriculture, which sits at this nexus of, a loss of biodiversity, human health, certainly energy, water, and climate. And if we're to deal with some of the larger problems, we're going to have to keep what we have that's in a natural state, restore what has been damaged, and convert from largely extractive measures in our agricultural system to something that's sustainable and regenerative. And the third use case for this natural asset company would be hybrid lands. So that would include landscapes that could have even built infrastructure, protected areas, as well as working lands all in one. So a natural asset company would acquire the rights to those ecosystem services in a given landscape. We would value that using a ecosystem service valuation and appraisal, which is a well-established discipline of looking at the various ecosystem services. It could be carbon sequestration, freshwater production, food provisioning, genetic potential, aesthetic and cultural values, and assigning a financial value to that so that we can come up with the underlying asset value that is held as the primary asset of these natural asset companies. In order to do that, we developed a way of accounting for those so that the natural asset company and its equity would be priced first on whatever monetized revenues that would be under GAAP or IFRS and reported. And that can include ecosystem services that are monetized, like carbon credits or biodiversity credits, et cetera. But importantly, the majority of the ecosystem services and natural asset values are not monetized. And so we came up with a accounting framework, statements of ecological performance, that would look at these values of ecosystem services. You can think of it like the flow of ecosystem services being somewhat akin to a natural production or an income statement in the GAAP world. The asset value is the underlying asset that is able to produce those ecosystem services, as well as its intrinsic values. And then certain key indicators of the health of the underlying asset, things like biodiversity and ecological health. The concept then is to value those ecosystem services, whether they're monetized today, might be monetized in the future or not, capturing that equity value so that a traditional equity might look at price to revenue, price to earnings. We also want this asset class to be valued in price to ecosystem services and the underlying asset itself. It's important to capture all of the values of nature and this natural asset class. So its existence value, nature is valuable in and of itself, even transcending human use. Capturing the use values that we enjoy, the host of ecosystem services, and as well the option value of the future, the value of the potential to monetize those ecosystem services in the future, and also bequeathing value. What value is there to handing off a healthy, planet to the next generation? And as David mentioned, half of our economy is dependent or highly dependent on a healthy ecosystem. And I'd argue maybe it's even more than that, because if we don't have a healthy ecosystem and a planet that's livable, there isn't an economy. And we also look at that 125 trillion of ecosystem services that are produced as the potential. So when we combine those, we realize this asset class is fundamental and really maps well with aligning the interests of financial creation of wealth, financial returns, and the conservation and conversion of our economy to one that's fairer, more resilient, and can truly be sustainable.
Great. So I can't see everyone. Hopefully you can see the screen. The next slide. Is everyone able to see the next slide?
Yes, it's fine.
Great, thank you. So that was a great introduction for the natural asset companies. Now I'm going to just keep moving forward and take questions at the end. But I wanted to talk a little bit about carbon markets. Carbon markets are different than natural asset companies, although some natural asset companies may include incorporation of carbon markets. We'll see what that ends up looking like when they are actually launched. But carbon markets are available for companies that need to, one, in the regulatory environment or compliance markets are required to reduce their emissions, and so they can purchase carbon credits or carbon credits in the carbon markets to help do that. And there are also voluntary carbon markets. There are a lot of companies that are looking to offset their reductions, whether it be flying for travel or on other emissions, and so they're participating on a voluntary level to do that. And there's something that I won't go into here as well, but there's insetting, and so where corporations are working internally to reduce emissions within their supply chain. And so as demand to cut emissions intensifies, we're seeing the voluntary carbon market growing in volume, and it's grown in 5-fold in 3 years, so it's rapidly developing. And why are these market values increasing? Well, there's a lot of increased participation, especially from oil companies, banks, airlines, and others. And here in this graphic, you can see just how much that market has increased in value from 2017 to 2021. And then in voluntary markets, it's important to understand the players. You have project developers who design and implement carbon offset projects that generate the credits. You have the standards bodies that are organizations that certify and set criteria for the carbon credits, such as Verra and Gold Standard. You have the brokers, who are the intermediaries providing or facilitating the carbon credit transactions. And then you have the end buyers, such as the individual corporation or people who are looking to offset their carbon credits. So actually now you can go to an airline or purchase an airline ticket and ask if you want to offset your flight by $2. I do want to point everybody, although I don't have it here, to a recent article in The Guardian that called out that 90% of Verra's Verra, which is the standards body, were bogus. So it would be an important article, and perhaps I can develop a resource list that I'll share with Jen later on, just on further reading, because there's a lot to read on it. And there are differences in the quality of carbon credits. There's high quality and low quality, and there's 5 criteria for examining the quality of a carbon offset. And so you can look at those there. There's additionality, how the credit is verified, permanence, how long will the activity last. So for instance, if you're planting trees, if a majority of the trees don't making it to maturity, or if you're sequestering carbon, and we all know as farmers, that's not a straight line. You can, have more carbon sequestering in some years versus others, and avoid leakage. So an increase in emissions should not occur elsewhere or account for any that do occur. And then there are 2 major categories of offset projects. One is avoidance and reduction, and then the other is removal and sequestration. And so a lot of the agriculture would be falling under the removal and sequestration. And then there are co-benefits as well. So we're seeing a lot of stacking of benefits, and that was happening a lot with the payment for ecosystem services. For those of you who are in Vermont, there was a working group for payment for ecosystem services that went on for about 3 years. I was not involved in that directly and really don't have a lot of information on that other than there was a report available. And at the conclusion of that study, they recommended not implementing a payment for ecosystem services for, some of the same reasons that we're critiquing carbon markets and natural assets. And so I would refer everybody to read that report and what the recommendations were of the working group, which were pretty solid. And recently there was also testimony in both the House and Senate Agricultural Committee in Vermont on payment for ecosystem services, which is worth listening if you haven't or didn't see that. And then what is the real impact? Well, quite frankly, it's the Wild West. A lot of this is unregulated. The science for measuring and verifying these impacts is not, it's in its infancy and still evolving. There's a critique at why should polluters benefit by, and I would say at a disproportionately higher level than the farmer does, because a lot of these brokers and polluters stand to receive much higher financial benefits than the farmers are doing. Who really benefits? The prices have remained too low, even at scale, for widespread adoption at this point. Most of the actual revenue generated goes to the brokers, traders, and project developers, not the farmers doing the actual work. Business is booming in the tech industry, technical providers, scientists to develop measurement technology platforms and other tools. And then the planet, it's yet to be determined if that the planet will actually benefit from these practices. And it's also taking the place of actual regulation and taxation. So this is carbon markets and credits are there in place of regulation and taxation, and then taxation could be used to actually fund farmers directly for the work they're doing as land stewards. I just wanted to show this video because it has not only a humorous take, which is refreshing, but it's also very accurate presentation and gives some great examples of projects that have been verified and funded through carbon tax credits, which are quite shocking. So I'm going to play this for about 10 minutes so you can sit back, get some popcorn and relax until we go to the next section of my presentation, where I'll just be focusing on just considerations for farmers and better alternatives and strategies. So here we go. Hopefully this works. All right. So yeah, if you have time to watch the rest of that video, there's about 10 more minutes of it, and it talks about other projects that have been funded through tax credits. So what I wanted to move into now, before we just open it up into some questions and answers, there's a lot to dissect here, and I know we're running out of time. But just from my experience and interactions and research, I'm by no means an expert in this area, and I don't think anybody is, because it's evolving so quickly and rapidly. As far as land management considerations, if you are approached by a broker, project developer, more and more farmers and even homeowners are receiving calls now. For these carbon markets, whether, it could be for not cutting down your trees or farmers for sequestering carbon, but my guess is mostly out west, but I'm sure we'll see it if we aren't already here in the Northeast soon. So for farmers, if you're leasing land, who is eligible for the payment, the farmer, the landowner? Change practices. Are you currently doing no-till or strip tilling, or currently planting cover crops? Change practices such as adopting variable rate nitrogen. All of those could be eligible practices. You often, in many instances, cannot sign up for the same acreages for multiple programs. And also key consideration, what are the future development rights for your land, particularly with the natural asset companies? We saw Douglas express over and over that the asset company would then claim the rights. So, and there's a lot that still needs to be explored in that. And then who owns the ecological assets that are created as a result of the practices and outcomes? measurement and verification. This is another Wild West area, and I'm sure many of you could speak to this and the issues, but is it outcome-based or practice-based? Is your data in order? You know, oftentimes they need 5 years history, and then you'll be committing to reporting for at least 20 years into the future. How and what will they measure? What is the frequency of reporting? Who owns the data, the right to privacy, and where is that data stored? And is the farmer responsible for data collection or the project developer? Contracts and pricing, lots of considerations here as well. Length of contract and escape clause, is there one? When are payments made? In some instances, for projects that we've seen, there was a great article about one in the Wall Street Journal. Actually, these farmers in the Amazon weren't paid until 8 years later. And so timing of those payments are a consideration. Consequences for not meeting targets. It often seems that farmers might be bearing the lion's share of risk in these deals. And so making sure that you're critically aware of all the risks that you're taking on in these contracts. Some contracts may not permit the use of NRCS equipment programs. There are some that do, but you need to just clarify and check before signing and negotiate. I feel like we should be pushing back to negotiate. Again, we have another basically supplier relationship. The farmer is the supplier. They are supplying the carbon sequestration or other services, and yet often have no ability to negotiate the terms of those contracts. So otherwise, let's not play the game. Let's change the rules. What are your risks and liabilities? Seek legal counsel. And then what is your context? Does this align with your values, your goals? Does it help you achieve the quality of life you want on your farm? And then better solutions. Solutions, should be led by farmers and indigenous people, not by Wall Street. If we want to support farmers, let's invest in the missing middle infrastructure. Let's invest in on-farm transitions directly. Let's tax polluting industries and use that to fund healthy soil practices and focus on real zero, not net zero solutions. And then there are some interesting approaches being taken in other parts of the country where they're, instead of selling nature to protect it, they're giving nature rights, and they would have the same rights or litigation rights as a human. And here are two examples, one in Stockholm and then another in Rome. And then in summary, carbon offsets cannot really truly be the centerpiece of any serious climate plan. The financial schemes strengthen feudalistic practices of contracting with farmers, further commodifying nature. And the systems are really not transformable. They're just distracting us from putting in place the regulations and policies that could then fund a just transition for all farmers. Okay, and then just quickly here, I wanted to mention about an upcoming event where we'll explore lots of these topics, the Northeast Healthy Soil Symposium. And then there is a survey that we're working on through Dartmouth College to survey the needs of livestock farmers in terms of infrastructure, markets, all of that. So with that, I'm going to stop share. And okay, great. And that concludes my presentation with, oh, right, 20 minutes exactly. I timed that perfectly. I practiced that beforehand. So, but I hope you enjoyed the video. I've never actually shown a video and presentation, but I thought, they really articulated the issues well. So.
Totally. And I do want to encourage, thank you so much. And I do want to encourage folks to either pop questions into the Whova interface, or you can also drop them into the Zoom chat if you have access to that, which I think a number of folks do. We have enough folks on the line. Probably we should not unmute as long as the chat function is working. So I'm just looking at some of the questions that we already have. Do you know I feel like we're going to ask this a couple of times, and you may not, but
Yeah.
do you know of any natural asset program that is providing a good return to farmers to really
So
make it worth their while?
natural asset, there are no
Or
natural.
carbon, any of them. Yeah, any of
Yeah,
these programs.
So currently there are no natural asset companies. They have not been approved yet. Through or by they're not available yet on the New York Stock Exchange. So last I heard, maybe in the fall of 2023 we'll see it. So that's yet to be concerned. And the other thing that I failed to mention is there is a complete lack of transparency in all of this. So we don't know how those natural asset companies will be set up, what they'll be doing for measurements yet. That's part of the work that I was doing with the Regenerative Food Network. They were attempting to create a natural asset company and getting ready for that, putting together their measurement systems, which was a combination of like on-farm soil sampling, biodiversity indexes, along with satellite surveys, things like that. And so we just don't know, but I think it's important to pay attention, watch, and be prepared for that. And, you know, personally, offer better alternatives. I think, I guess there's, different philosophies and mindsets people have. You clearly saw Douglas, he felt strongly that that was a strategy that would preserve nature, that if we didn't monetize it, we didn't value it, but Indigenous people have been valuing, honoring, and respecting nature for millennia without monetizing it. So I think we need to look at the constructs that these financial schemes are based on, and are they getting us where we need to go and want to be? And then carbon markets. It's really hard to find a lot of data because, again, a lot of the contracts, if you're a farmer contracting, you may have a gag clause where you can't talk about it. So again, there's not a lot of transparency in these deals. If you look at the actual pricing, per ton of carbon sequestered, it ranges, it fluctuates like, any market does. And so sometimes you're seeing prices $12 to $30. And so that's, per acre. So is that enough to move your bottom line? And then looking at all the work attached for it, like I would never be able to, articulate what works best. That's why you have to look at your context. And if that additional payment could help preserve your farm, keep that farm in your family history, that's a really personal question that people have to look at, evaluate, and see if they want to participate in. What I've been doing on the policy level is trying to advocate for better policy solutions, and one where the farmers are not at the bottom of the food chain. And so we're seeing a lot of other people make huge profits on this, and it's just, there's just commodity pricing is what I see. So, and I went into this like originally like really excited. Oh, great! These could be potential. And then when you look at the mechanics of how they're starting to come together, it's just for further perpetuating what I would characterize as a feudalistic system that's keeping farmers locked in economics that don't work.
And to tag on to that, how long are those agreements? And that I recognize as a pro and a con to something being a long or short, but I'm curious how long they are.
Yeah, some that we're seeing, 20 years. And then some were, if you watch further along in that video, they reference one that only lasts for a year. So, and then that, speaks to the quality of the carbon credit as well. And the idea of permanence, and are we really setting out to accomplish what are we really achieving what we're setting out to accomplish with these markets? So, it seems a little bit of smoke and mirrors because it is opaque and we're not really able to get to those details because the market isn't regulated well. And so there are some industry groups that are pushing for more integrity and regulation in the markets. but it is certainly the Wild West.
So one of the other questions, do the various systems have a preference over forestry or grasslands as a carbon asset?
No, I don't think so. I think it just depends on the project developer, and it's, and who's signing up to do projects. So it just depends on their goals and how they're setting them up. Oh, there's a comment, somebody's
Yeah.
mentioning something about the payment for ecosystem services. But I think, and a lot of these programs have been in existence for a long time, particularly in forestry and in the global south. It's just, it's newer here, and looking at agriculture, that's, I think, maybe the frontier. So I think there's more experience with forestry projects than agriculture.
That totally makes sense as well. So, and this question from William, a lot of the payment for ecosystem services entities I've looked into have made guarantees along the lines of carbon sellers will get at least 70% of profits from credits sold. Are these guarantees common, and do they better balance the scales in favor of farmers?
I'm not as familiar with how the payment for ecosystem service projects are being structured, so I'm not sure I can answer that question. But again, I know that the working group in Vermont did not recommend moving forward with that. Next week at the Northeast Healthy Soil Network, we'll be hearing from Cornell Extension and the work they were doing around, or the exploration they were doing around payment for ecosystem services. But, that's a question I have as well. And if there were initiatives or project developers that were led by farmers in communities, could the governance structures be, developed differently so that it could reward farmers at a higher ratio than a lot of these other projects that you're hearing about. And then there's still, though, the more fundamental issue of, do we want to award these offsets to businesses that are polluting? Should they get the benefit of that as opposed to setting tighter regulations? But I think that's a much bigger question than we have time to explore, and I'm sure people's thoughts on that vary greatly. But yeah. But it's just a major concern that I have, both from being inside the development of one and just what I'm reading and hearing and the language that I'm using. I mean, Douglas used the word capture all the value of nature. That scares me, and capture it. And, these natural asset companies that own rights to it will be profiting off it. And so I think we're at risk of giving up a lot. And I think what we're doing is further perpetuating a system that's highly extractive, and we're all incredibly smart people. I think we can come up with and imagine better solutions that would help move us forward in the work that we're trying to do, and value land stewards for the outcomes that they're producing on the land.
Nico, would you mind unmuting yourself?
I am unmuted, I think.
Oh, good for that. Yes, you are. Could you ask your question?
Yes, I think you're touching on something really important here in that one of the things that we really don't talk about is, I'm gonna go a little deeper here because we're talking to a panel of or participants that are sort of deep into this material. Mm-hmm. is really the complete and utter disregard for thermodynamics and the total disregard of industrial processes for biology. And as long as we can't incorporate the standards of efficiency in biology into the performance parameters of nature, meaning as long as we treat nature as an industrial input, we're going to be in big trouble. And that is really something that we should engage as advocacy groups. We should engage the scientific community into looking into. You know, I just read an article this morning that the Danish government, for the first time, is pumping thousands of tons, 15,000 tons of carbon dioxide under their continental shelf. And that's being hailed as like the offset of cement and I don't know what production from Belgium. And, you know, they're literally pumping it in a pipeline over there, putting it in the ground. In my understanding of physics, that violates the entropy laws of thermodynamics, and it'll cost more energy to do than what we actually are sequestering. And so unless the energy that we're using for that is carbon neutral, we're fucking ourselves badly 20 years from now, right? Or whatever the carbon cycle is for whatever energy we're using. Excuse my explicit language, but I'm sort of getting to the point where I'm really tired of the false accounting that we're doing. That also goes back into the ICPP's standardization of every metric in the climate world down to the CO2 equivalents, right? Which, you know, gets methane into a totally different ballgame than it needs to be in terms of half-life and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, I think we all, as people who are in the science of grazing and, you know, sort of deeper in that world, have at least come across that anecdotally or have engaged with it and understand it. But how do we actually get the science community that is being asked to evaluate the energy balance of this carbon sequestration stuff, to engage with that in a more productive way? And I think really that's a fundamental question. You know, the economics will work or not work, but whether it becomes sustainable, exploitative in the end, both to farmers and to nature, is really the other question.
Yeah, that's a good question for the 4 o'clock panel, right?
I feel like that is a perfect opportunity to look at and address some potential shifts in terms of our research priorities for the region. Certainly, it's a perfect opportunity for that.
Get ahead of all of this market progression. Yes, you know, I'm not a scientist, but I don't know how you evaluate the complexity, how you measure and reduce it to a counting sheet, and it just doesn't make sense to me. So yeah, so I think there are better ways to support the work that we're trying to do.
So in
And
addition,
farmers.
oh, sorry, I apologize.
Well, and farmers too. I mean,
Yeah.
that's, you know, so.
So an additional question, a commenting question is, often connecting ecosystem services to society and farmers is done through prescription, property, penalty, payment, and persuasion. In the US, we use persuasion, prescriptions, and payments. In New Zealand and the Netherlands and Spain have approached different ecosystem services, I assume, issues through prescription and penalties. Costa Rica has decades of a successful PES model. So what do you see as the balance of prescription, property, penalty, payment, persuasion? Recognizing that you're a person on the ground measuring this and then also looking at the policy ramifications. You're that person in the middle who's trying to do both.
Well, personally, I think persuasion, I mean, I know many farmers who, you know, are either already implementing this and they can't sustain their farm because farming is not a viable business. So I think supporting farmer viability can actually go a lot further, and the infrastructure that supports that, you know, increasing. One of the recommendations from the Payment for Ecosystems Working Group in Vermont was not to create a PES program, but to supplement funding through the Conservation Resource Program, that farmers found that useful. And so I think those strategies are probably much more effective than anything that's tied to markets. I don't know why we have to tie solutions to markets to persuade farmers. I don't think that's necessary. I think providing the cost share to help farms transition, those types of programs, if they were funded, and if we had regulation and taxation, we could fund more of that. Those are more effective strategies. So.
Another question that came in is how much of the offsets claimed by polluters comes from their customers' voluntary payments or from government tax breaks and incentives?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know those statistics off the top of my head, but I'd be curious to look that up myself. Again, it's hard to get information on some of this because it's new and emerging and a lot of it's not transparent. But I think that's a good question that we should ask and see where and if we can find answers to.
And if we can find answers, I mean, there are some really excellent questions that have been asked. And if there are, if we can find answers to them, we can certainly post them in the Whova chat or in, the resources for this as well.
Yes, I can follow up with a number of suggested websites and reading on this topic to look
Fantastic.
further. Yeah.
Yep. That would be fantastic. And so do you know, are there any examples? Has litigation on behalf of nature been happening? That's just fascinating.
Not in this country.
Right.
Yeah,
I was just saying, I didn't know if you could recall any from another country too that we could look to as an example.
I mean, I know there are environmental lawsuits, but I think what Rome is doing is really interesting, and I certainly want to follow that. And they're taking these measures because of the abuse, and Costa Rica and somebody just posted Costa Rica and Ecuador have granted. So, I would like to see the US get on that bandwagon. And then whenever we develop policy, like we often forget or neglect to look at what are the unintended consequences of the policy that we're creating. So I think it's always important to look at it through that lens. Is that often those unintended consequences have impacted farmers in a negative way as well. So how do we craft policy in a holistic way and not just as a result of a problem that we're trying to fix, but a vision that we're trying to create or achieve rather.
So thank you so much. I think we've come to the end of our time. We really appreciate your time in sharing a lot of background on this and some of your real world experience doing it too. I just want to invite folks to come back in about 15 minutes. We are swinging from marketing that we worked in this morning into this markets conversation with Julie. And then our next phase is a presentation by Dave Pratt, helping us to look at profitability from the farmer side, trying to figure out how to identify our businesses in a profitable way. So come on back in about 15 minutes. Thank you all so much.